Welcome to participants in Zoom and YouTube livestream viewers. My name is Frans-Paul van der Putten. I'm the coordinator of the Klingendahl China Center. I will be the moderator of this webinar on China's approach to the Western Balkans and the relevance of China's approach for the European Union. We have three speakers who will join us today. Jonathan Hatwell, the head of the China division at the European External Action Service. Plamen Tonchev, head of the Asia unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, and Wouter Zweers, who is a research fellow at the Klingendahl Institute and the coordinator of the Klingendahl Balkans Hub. So with three outstanding speakers, whom I will first interview, and after that, as a Zoom participant, you can ask questions via the platform's Q&A function. So in the last 20 minutes of this webinar, which will last 1 hour, you will have the floor. Our discussion today will be on our latest research on the EU and China's involvement in the Western Balkans. The Klingendahl Institute, together with ECFR, published a joint report just recently, which was titled China and the EU in the Western Balkans, a zero-sum game. I will not go into the report itself too much. The report is publicly available from our website if you haven't seen it already. But the key question, as the subtitle shows, is are EU and Chinese interests in the Western Balkans compatible, or are they mutually exclusive? The report gives a quite detailed overview of Chinese activities in the Western Balkans countries, also in the responses and perceptions of the countries themselves, and what all this means for the EU's interests and approach to the region. The report concludes that no, it's not a zero-sum game, but it's also not a matter of easy compatibility between EU and Chinese interests. I will not go into the details of the report itself, because I think a lot of the things that are in the report are also the subject of our debate today. And I would like to move on to our three speakers, starting with the first speaker, who will be Plamen Tonchev of the International Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens. We have 8 minutes each for the three speakers, and the format that we will be using is that I will ask questions, and so we have an interview style approach rather than just the more traditional monologues where speakers just give their presentation. So moving to Plamen, and I think we would like to focus first on the question: what is China actually doing in the region? So Plamen, can you tell us a bit about your view on what is actually drawing China to the Western Balkans? What is driving its approach, and what are its intentions and its interests in the region?
Right, thanks very much, Frans-Paul. First of all, let me congratulate the authors of this report, which I find insightful, much needed, and very timely. We have to say that the Western Balkans were a bit out of the spotlight for a while, after the Dayton Agreement of '95, but now that they have come back to the spotlight, so this report is really, really useful. I would say that in a way, the world and Europe in particular has rediscovered the region. And of course, China is a major actor in the Western Balkans. I'd say that on its way, in its drive towards Europe after the global financial crisis of 2008, China started investing heavily in the Western Balkans, mostly in infrastructure. And I think that your report quite rightly highlights the fact that infrastructure projects executed by the Chinese are not standalone activities. They are part of a broader Chinese strategy, which is well known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Let me tell you that within this larger format of 17+1 across Central and Eastern Europe, the Chinese, or rather Chinese banks have provided loans to the tune of around 12 billion to date. And the vast majority of these loans actually goes to the Western Balkans. Possibly 60% of all the Chinese loans to 17 plus 1 is concentrated exactly in the Western Balkans. And of course, there's this very visible project that the Chinese are looking at, the Land Sea Express Line, or this transport corridor to be constructed from Piraeus in Greece all the way towards Budapest in Hungary, Central Europe, which is one of the flagship BRI projects in Europe. There are very many controversial aspects, of Chinese presence in the Western Balkans when it comes to standards, and I'll speak about this in a moment. But we have to say that at the same time, there's a growing degree of sophistication of the projects that Chinese companies are involved in. And again, I'll speak about this hopefully in a few moments, if you ask me about it.
Well, Plamen, that's a very good suggestion. The first thing I wanted to ask is that you just mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. What, in your view, I mean, how important is the Western Balkans as a region within the broader framework of the Belt and Road Initiative? How important is it to China?
I would say that there are no signs that the Chinese have a specific regional strategy which applies to the Western Balkans. In fact, the Western Balkans are seen by the Chinese as part of Central and Eastern Europe, or at least in institutional terms. All the six, or rather all the five Western Balkan countries recognized by China, because Kosovo isn't. So the five Western Balkan countries are seen by the Chinese as part of the 17 plus 1 format. But it's also true that the Chinese always prefer to work on a bilateral basis. And you can see that, judging from the bulk of all the Chinese loans, the Western Balkans are a prominent part of Central and Eastern Europe.
All right. And Plamen, if you look at the countries that make up the region, I mean, you already mentioned that Kosovo has a special position because it's not recognized as a state by China. What about the other five countries? Can you see diversity or commonalities in the Chinese approach?
I would say that it is a general rule. The Chinese work with these countries on a bilateral basis. They discuss projects, potential projects, with the governments of these countries, mostly on a governmental level, not with NGOs, or not even at a subnational level. They would work mostly with the governments of these five countries. And it's quite clear that Serbia stands out, because Serbia has absorbed, I would say, up to 1/3 of all the Chinese loans provided across Central and Eastern Europe, possibly 33 to 35%. And even, it's not just loans, there's a couple of truly FDI, foreign direct investment projects, greenfield projects in Serbia, carried out by the Chinese. But I would say that Serbia stands out also for political reasons. It's not just a destination for Chinese investment. Serbia stands out, and you quite rightly highlight this in the report. But I would say, I would add to your key findings about Serbia something that will also have to be factored in for political reasons. I think that Serbia stands out because it still has a very strong hangover, if I may call it hangover, from the Yugoslav war back in the 90s. Because we have to understand that in psychological terms, there's still a very conspicuous trauma in Serbian society after Serbia's defeat. There are still very vivid memories of the 1999 NATO campaign in relation to Kosovo. There are very vivid memories of the 1999 bombing of Belgrade, including the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And Serbs feel that they've been pointed the finger at. There were the ICTY trials, if you remember. And now we have this authoritarian regime of Alexander Vucic, who, by the way, started out as a minister of propaganda in the last Milosevic cabinet. And there's a very strong anti-European mood in Serbia. Literally yesterday, I checked the latest Balkan Monitor 2020. Let me quote two very interesting findings. There were two questions. The first one was, would EU membership be a good thing for the national economy? And look at the positive answers in the 5 countries, in the 6 countries. 87% positive answers in Albania, 75% in Kosovo. It's a potential question. It's a theoretical question, but 75% of Kosovars responded yes. In North Macedonia, 57% positive answers, 56% in Bosnia, 54% in Montenegro, and now brace up, only 26% in Serbia. Only 1 out of 4 Serbs thought that joining the EU would be good for their economy. And the second finding, the second question is, when do you expect the accession of your country to the EU? By 2025, by 2030, or never? Now, the largest segment of the sample, 46% of Serb respondents replied never. I mean, it's really flabbergasting and eye-opening to realize that nearly half the Serb respondents do not imagine themselves as EU citizens. It is this anti-European, diffuse and persistent anti-European mood in Serbia that actually explains China's penetration or China's growing presence in the country.
Well, before we continue on this particular topic, also with the other two speakers, I have just one more question for you, Plamen. I think the big thing that many people are wondering about is, so this growing Chinese economic presence and economic influence in the Western Balkans region. What will China make use of this to achieve also particular political, or let's say non-economic aims? Do you think that this is the case, and what is your view on this?
I think that the reasons behind China's drive towards the Western Balkans at this stage are primarily economic. And in fact, I'm not sure that there's a coherent strategy, because there are very many SOEs, very large state-owned companies interested in projects in the region. Of course, they enjoy political support provided by Beijing and the Chinese embassies across the region. But I think that at this stage, the motivation is primarily economic. At the same time, the Chinese do view the Western Balkans as a springboard, as an opportunity to increase their political clout across Central and Eastern Europe. And this is quite obvious in Serbia, because the relationship between Belgrade and Beijing is not just economic, it's becoming more and more political and even military in terms of military cooperation.
Thank you so much, Plamen. We move on now to our second speaker, Wouter Zweers, research fellow at the Klingendahl Institute, and who specializes in research on the relationship between the EU and the Western Balkans. So Wouter, in the view of what Plamen just told us, can I ask you, do you think that China's presence in the region undermines the EU's interest there?
Well, thank you, Frans Paul, for that question, which is, I think, a fairly important one. And to me, the simple answer is yes, though not always. I mean, this is also what you emphasized already in the introduction, that this is also the outcome of our report that we wrote. And if we just look at the value base of China's engagement with the Western Balkans and compare that to that of the EU, I would say that it's fundamentally different. If we look at what the EU searches to achieve in the Western Balkans, it's to develop these countries into multi-party democracies with an independent judiciary, to promote respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, rights for minorities, to promote a functioning market economy with economic opportunities for all. And these are all things that China is fundamentally not, so this value base of engagement is quite different. And that means that in practice, China does simply not promote the values and norms that the EU searches to promote in the region. I wouldn't say that China works actively against the European Union's objectives. We have not seen signs of China taking a spoiler role, such as Russia has done in the past with these real malign actions that search to undermine EU integration. Think of alleged meddling in elections or disinformation campaigns. These are things of which, in the case of China, I have not seen any indication. But by simply being there and by creating economic and political links, China does expose the countries of the Western Balkans to a real alternative model of statehood with alternative values, and that has an impact on the EU's interest in the region.
So that's an important point that you're making, Wouter. You're saying it's not an intended negative impact, but there is a negative impact. Can you say a bit more about how, let's say, on the one hand, how damaging this then is for the EU's interest and for the relationship between the EU and the Western Balkans countries? Yes, and on the other hand, whether there's also an actual or potential Chinese side of Chinese influence that is actually beneficial for EU interest.
Of course, and to see how China impacts the EU's interest, I think we should zoom in a little bit. I mean, we know that the countries in the Western Balkans, they need to transpose EU law into their own legislative systems as part of the accession process. They make significant reforms in virtually all policy fields. I mean, think of good governance reforms intended to ensure democratization and independent judiciary, but also reforms to align with EU standards on trade, the environment, data protection, public procurement, etc. Now, the Chinese standards and the modes of operation in various of these fields differ significantly, and that's what causes the problems. If we look at, for example, public procurement, the infrastructure projects and infrastructure investments in the Western Balkans by China, these are agreed upon between governments directly. So a prime example is the Bar-Boljara highway in Montenegro, which is a project that followed a deal between China and the Montenegrin government, And the problem is that these contracts are not awarded through public procurement, but through special law allowing to circumvent public tenders. And here you see that this is a deviation from the EU standard, and that EU standard is not there for nothing, of course. I mean, fair public procurement is a crucial method for the EU to counter high-level corruption, to counter bribery, to counter misuse of state funds, and to facilitate open market competition. So what we see is that these kind of deals, they do not only undermine directly this EU standard on public procurement, but they also undermine the EU objective of the fight against corruption and other efforts that are part of the EU's objectives for democratization in the region. So I think it's this deviation in standards that causes the problems, and that's the case, I think, in many fields. I mean, I highlighted public procurement, but we could also discuss personal data protection, sustainability, and other policy fields. You also asked, of course, about situation in which also China's presence in the region may be beneficial. Well, I think that is mainly in a way, I mean, the economic development of the region is something that both the region itself and the EU and China strive for. And the fact that there is Chinese infrastructure investments and other investments, I mean, if these investments would be done under with respect to EU standards, then of course the result of those investments are positive for all actors, I would say.
Okay, and Wouter, if we take into account also the perceptions and the interests and the needs and the concerns of the Western Balkans countries themselves, which is an aspect which is also in the report. Looking at it from that side, and also, what would you say then? What can the EU do to mitigate the challenges that are posed by China in this regard?
Well, I think that the EU in any case, should accept that these countries continue to search economic benefits from China. You know, I mean, as you rightfully mentioned, I mentioned the interest of the Western Balkans themselves. These countries should be central in that regard as well. And what we see is that also in the EU, there is a number of member states that cooperate with China, that search economic benefits. So I think the EU should in any case be wary that it does not become hypocritical in condemning such cooperation. But what would be important is to really emphasize and to clearly communicate what is and what is not compatible with EU standards, and what the EU expects from the Western Balkans countries if they want to become members. You know, and we've seen at the beginning of this year that a new accession methodology or a revised accession methodology was adopted. And elements like conditionality and political steering will that are in that methodology will play a key role in that regard. And I think lastly, you know, the EU should also acknowledge, and we all should maybe acknowledge, that the EU integration path for the Western Balkan countries is a very difficult one. You know, and the EU should offer all kinds of support in that regard, and is also, of course, already doing so. So that's both financial and technical support, know-how, and whatsoever. But what is sometimes missing, and that's especially my impression in the member states, is the political support. You know, to make sure that this EU membership perspective is a really credible one, and to make sure that the countries in the Western Balkans, especially the ones with which negotiations are now starting or are already advanced, that these countries are really treated as future members of the Union. And that's, I think, a key aspect.
Well, one last thing before we move on to Jonathan. In your answer, you seem to suggest that to the extent that the EU considers China's influence in the region problematic, it should focus its efforts to address this primarily on its relationship with the region itself, and not so much on its relationship with China. Is that right, or would you say that it has to, EU should address both sides?
Of course, the EU should address both sides. I mean, I focus mainly on the EU-Western Balkans relation also because that's my key topic of research. So I would suggest to also pose this question to our other speakers that we have in this webinar today. Now, of course, the EU needs to do both, but I think the relation with the Western Balkans itself, the political relations are key. Also, the economic ones. I mean, it's also very important that the EU is response to economic needs. And yesterday we saw that the European Commission proposed an economic and investment plan for the region, which I think is very welcome in that regard. Though we, of course, still need to assess what is exactly in there. But no, both elements will be important, I would say.
Thank you, Wouter. Now we move on to Jonathan. Jonathan Hatwell, the head of the China division at the European External Action Service. Jonathan, can I ask you, how relevant is the Western Balkans as a region in the overall to the overall relationship between the European Union and China?
Yeah, thanks, Frans Paul. And before answering, I just want to add my words of appreciation as well, and congratulations to you and to Wouter and the other co-authors of the excellent report. And thanks for having me here today. And as participants will see, I'm coming to this not as somebody having any expertise in relation to the Western Balkans, but rather from the broader perspective of EU's policy towards China. But the beauty of that role for me is that China is a factor now in every region when it comes to EU's foreign policy and also internal policies, and something that gives me opportunities like this to listen and learn about new areas. So specifically, turning to China and the Western Balkans, I would say it's something that we've been paying increasing attention to over the past 18 months, couple of years. So there has been a rising awareness of precisely what I mentioned: China as a factor impinging on or influencing the parameters for our own policy that we need to pay closer attention to. I guess we'll come to this in a moment when talking more broadly about the EU's China policy and how this fits in. But 18 months ago, we adopted a new policy approach towards China for the EU, known as the Strategic Outlook, which got a lot of attention because it, in a nutshell, set out a more assertive and robust approach towards China, but also recognized the necessity of engaging with China and cooperating precisely because of China's increasing reach and influence, which we see globally now, including in the Western Balkans, and in giving effect to this new approach, there are a number of concrete actions that were identified, and one of those actions specifically was about looking at China as an actor and a factor in other parts of the world, and the action was framed in terms of the EU's interest in stability, sustainable economic development, and good governance in our partner countries, with an emphasis on the Western Balkans, and in that regard, taking account of China, the need for us to apply more robustly the existing bilateral agreements and financial instruments we have, and to work with China to follow similar principles, or the same principles. And we say very clearly in the relevant part of the strategic outlook, and it's in line with what you have in your report, saying earlier that Chinese business and investment activity in the Western Balkans and in other regions is a positive insofar as it contributes to the growth of receiving economies, but we did also already back then in March 2019 highlight some concerns in relation to this economic engagement on China's part, and particularly the fact that the investments often neglect socioeconomic and financial sustainability. I could add there, although it isn't explicitly mentioned, environmental concerns. And also the question of indebtedness and potential transfer of control over strategic assets and resources, although that's something that we've seen more in perhaps in Africa. And so as a response to that, and this brings us back again to the Western Balkans, the strategic outlook says very clearly that the EU needs to continue and deepen its efforts to promote stability, sustainable economic development, and respect for good governance in these partner countries, using the frameworks we have, and deepen that. And from that point of view, as Walter just mentioned, the adoption yesterday of the economic and investment plan, I think, is a very significant step. And I would say it is worth having in mind that in relation to what was said before about by Plum about China offering alternatives to the countries of the region, that is also I think a message for us that we need to up our game in terms of the offer, both in terms of the offer itself, and the plan announced yesterday is very significant, with the 9 billion euros in investment, plus the potentially 20 billion further through investment guarantees, and the 10 flagship investment projects, including in areas where lately China has come to dominate the narrative and the perception, so on infrastructure investment. But it's also about better, we need to up our game also in terms of communication, because there is this mistaken and slightly bizarre and frustrating perception sometimes in the region, and we saw that again recently in relation to support in the context of the pandemic, that the EU is doing very little for these countries and China is doing a lot. Whereas if you actually drill down into the figures, the reverse, if anything, is true. But that's a perception that has been that has built up for a variety of reasons, and certainly the EU needs not only to step up its engagement, but also get better at communicating what it's doing.
Thank you. And you just mentioned the strategic outlook of last year. So one of the things that caught, I think, everybody's attention in the strategic outlook was the mentioning that in the governance domain, China is a systemic rival to the European Union.
Yeah.
Would you say that that the Western Balkans is a very important, or perhaps even the most important test case for the EU to engage with China, or to engage with this challenge, I should say, how to deal with China as a systemic rival in the governance domain?
Yeah, systemic rival. That's of course one of the things that got the most attention when the strategic outlook was published, both in the international media and also from China. I think it's no secret that China is not particularly thrilled at us applying this label to them. But you know, it's there for a reason. It's there because we think it describes the nature of our relationship and our interaction in a number of spheres. Of course, the important thing to have in mind is that it's one dimension, and you know, if I had to distill the approach of the strategic outlook into one word or one concept, it's multifaceted approach, and we say very clearly that we have different modes of engagement with China. In some areas we are cooperation partners. In other areas we're negotiating, and we have to find a balance of interests. In yet more areas we're competitors, and in some respects we're systemic rivals. And as I said, China doesn't accept or recognise that term, and tries to discourage it or to counter it. So specifically on your question, are the Western Balkans the main theatre where this plays out? I would say not particularly. It's not linked to one or other geographical region. It's something that applies also in the multilateral sphere when it comes to different approaches on human rights, for example, where China seeks to posit a hierarchy of rights, with economic and social rights being more important than civil and political rights. Also in the case of internet governance, and so on. So it's not geography specific, and I wouldn't say that among geographic regions, the Western Balkans is where we face this most acutely, but it's certainly present. I mean, I refer back to what Walter said, and I share that. He said that China is exposing the countries of the region to alternative models of statehood and different values, and that's precisely the essence of what we mean when we call China a systemic rival. So yes, there is something in that, but it doesn't preclude possibilities for cooperation or for our agendas to converge. And I very much share also what the previous speakers said about us having a common interest in promoting the economic development of the Western Balkans, and if we can achieve the centrality of that goal in China's engagement, and it's done in a way that doesn't undermine the standards that we're trying to promote, because we believe it's in the interest of the region and because it's an integral part of their European perspective, then there's plenty of scope for converging interests.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We have about 23 minutes left for the webinar, so I would like to move on to the next stage, where the participants, the people who are watching us through Zoom, can pose questions. The procedure is that you can use the Q&A function to enter your question, and then I will give you the word, will give you the floor, and then you can post. The microphone will be unmuted. You can then pose your question. Also, please make clear who you are addressing the question to. And the first question that we are going to discuss is one that was submitted by Kari van Pinksteren, who has a question about the perceptions and the response from the countries in the region themselves. So, Kari, can you ask your question and also explain who you would like to address the question?
Thank you very much, Frans-Paul. I will have to quickly look which questions I asked. I don't know if you have it in front of you.
Oh yes, I can tell you what your question is.
Yes.
So, to what extent do you think the Western Balkans are only using China to pressurize the EU to do more for the Western Balkans? Do you think they are positive about this Chinese involvement? And do you think that they have the idea that China is actually making through, doing what it has promised that it would do? So this.
That's a question. Thank you very much, Frans-Paul. That would be a question I would like to ask to Wouter.
Okay.
Maybe if he can say something more about that.
Okay, Wouter.
Of course, and thank you, Gary, for that question. I think first we should be wary to not see all the countries in the region alike. I mean, there's differences between the countries. Overall, I think there is a certain, and this is also what we signal in the report, there is a certain disappointment in many of the countries in the region that, well, China's the promise of China as a country that can bring economic development to the region has not yet fully taken off, among others for a lack of investments, or lack of expected investments at least. But so there is some sense of disappointment as well. Still, if you look at this perception, and this is also what Jonathan touched upon, the perception that the EU does little and that China does a lot, this is something that is actively promoted sometimes also in the region by some governments. And here I would like to especially point to Serbia, where we see that they really try to play this political game of balancing between China and the EU. And then on the one hand, that could serve, I think, to increase its negotiation position vis-a-vis the EU. And on the other hand, also to postpone maybe painful reforms that lead to further democratization. And let's be honest, we also see it in the report yesterday on Serbia. There's still a lot to do on democratization in the country, and we've really seen a stagnation of reforms in the past years. So, I mean, the Freedom House report of last year called Serbia only a partly free country instead of a free democracy. So I think for especially the Serbian government that does not seem to be very that is not very this is not doing very well in promoting democratic reform. I mean, the relations with China are a way, in fact, to also avoid such reforms and to mitigate some of the pressure from the EU. And this is, of course, a real problem for the EU.
Okay, thank you, Wouter. It's possible, I mean, we have quite a lot of questions, so I cannot guarantee that we can actually address all the questions, but we will do our best. So let's move on to the next question, which is posed by Dusan Relic. Can you ask your question and also explain who you would like to address the question?
Yes, thank you. But I thought that I've sent in the question via the chat role, but it doesn't matter. I'll repeat it gladly. As a German citizen, I was quite worried about the tone implied in your report, as if Chinese investments automatically change the political situation in a country. And you know, in Germany, we had in the last couple of years, every year between $5 billion and $15 billion in Chinese investments which were made public. A number of investments in Germany from China were never disclosed. They are business transactions. So if there is an automatism, which you seem to imply, that simply because of Chinese presence, the fabric of the society changes as well, should we do something about Chinese investments in Western Europe as well, particularly in the biggest and most important country, which is Germany?
And who would you like to answer this question?
Well, I think that all three of the gentlemen, of the speakers, implied that we should that we should be worried about Chinese investments.
So in that case, perhaps, Jonathan, is this a question that you would like to answer?
Sure, I'm happy to comment on that. Although I suspect that the other panelists will also have something to add. So I'd make 2 points on that question. First point is, and I think the other panelists are probably better qualified to speak to this than I am, but I think what gives rise to the potential concerns in the region is the interplay between the substantial and not always very transparent Chinese investment and the currently relatively weak institutional framework, which where there is already an expectation and discussion about strengthening that and improving that. So the interplay between the two makes it an issue of legitimate interest, and that, given that the EU member states themselves, by definition, have already fulfilled the acquis in institutional terms, means that the same conditions don't obtain in the case of the EU member states. So that's the first point. And then the second point I would add is that in actual fact, there has been growing concern also about about the influence or impact of certain types of Chinese investment within the EU as well. And precisely in response to that, we have adopted a new coordination mechanism for investment screening. It's not specific to China. It's applies to all foreign direct investment that meets the criteria. But I think it's no secret that Chinese investment was one of the drivers behind the initiative, and there's an expectation that Chinese investment will form a significant portion of the investments that are covered. So when the criteria are met, then there is now a mechanism in place at EU level where it's actually coming into full application in 3 days' time on the 10th of October. But the regulation is already adopted, whereby there will have to be, there's a notification procedure and then an exchange of information and the possibility for other member states or the Commission to raise concerns. Now, as I said, it's not specific to China, but it will certainly apply also to certain Chinese investments.
Thank you, Jonathan, for explaining about the investment screening framework or coordination framework.
If I may come in just with one sentence, what's preventing the EU from introducing the same mechanism also for Southeast Europe?
Jonathan, is that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand, and I also don't really know the answer, but certainly as future member states, the candidate countries would be indeed expected to transpose this as part of the acquis and participate in the information exchange system for investment screening. But as to the exact timing and sequencing of that within the accession process, I don't have the answer.
Wouter or Plamen, is there anything you would like to add? Plamen, yes.
Yeah, if I can quickly address the question raised by my colleague and friend Dusan Relic. And we've discussed this on previous occasions. I quite agree that there's a lot to expect of political and business elites in the Western Balkans. I agree that corruption takes two to tango. We shouldn't attribute all the problems to the Chinese companies, Chinese counterparts, of course. At the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that there have been very many controversial cases which actually mar the image of Chinese contractors and China in general. Wouter already spoke about Montenegro and, of course, the highway between Bar and Bolere. There's a very, I would say, equally scandalous case in North Macedonia, the two highways in North Macedonia, and the way Sino Hydro was contracted without any real tender after one-on-one negotiations. And in fact, this particular company came up with a much more expensive offer, which was accepted. And in fact, this scandal in North Macedonia contributed to and accelerated the fall of the Nikola Gruevski government, right? And Gruevski is now in Hungary, having been granted political asylum. Speaking of Hungary, and this is one of the cases which we see replicated in the Western Balkans, sadly. The Hungarian section of the flagship project, the Belgrade-Budapest railway track, the Hungarian section has been turned into a law passed in parliament, but it's been classified for 10 years. And this is unthinkable by EU standards. Dusan is quite right when he says that perhaps there are there are large Chinese investment projects in Germany as well. Yes, but we know that when Midea took over KUKA back in 2016, we know the price tag. It was about 5 billion euros, wasn't it? In many cases in the Western Balkans and in Hungary, we don't know the real price of these projects. And that's the fundamental difference.
All right. Unless Wouter wants to add something, then we will move on to another question. The next question that I want to highlight is by Jacob Mardell. And I want to explain that it's important for you to repeat your question on the microphone, because not all of the viewers are able to actually read the Q&A text that you submit. So, Mr. Mardell, can I ask you to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for the insightful report as well, I just wanted to say. And I just have a query about something in the report, which mentioned the China-Europe Sea Land Express route as Beijing's most important strategic objective in the region. And my personal impression of this is that it's slightly overhyped, and I didn't find it massively significant in reality. And I just wanted to you to convince me otherwise, basically, or to sort of provide your thinking behind thinking of this as a sort of important strategic objective and something of significance. So I guess that'll be directed at Wouter. But I don't know if Plyman also has some convincing arguments. I'd also be happy to hear them.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Wouter, do you want to address this?
Of course, yeah. Well, thank you for that excellent question. And whether the Land and Sea Express route is Beijing's most important strategic objective. Well, I think if we look at the investments from China in the region, that they're clearly focused primarily on infrastructure, and that I think will be an important argument to indeed say that is Beijing's most important strategic objective. But as we also search to acknowledge in the report, of course, China's objectives for the Western Balkans are not merely economic. I mean, in line with China's expanding role on the world stage, there is a political or a geopolitical agenda behind that to basically influence other regions in the world. And what we also discuss in the report is these processes through which China and the EU basically search to have an impact in the Western Balkans. And one of those processes is this socialization process, which means that by simply being there, by having political contacts, they promote the EU and China promote their own value systems and their own standards in the Western Balkans. And of course, by simply by economic investments and by political contacts, China does also engage in the socialization process, and it does also promote its own values. So there's certainly also we should certainly also realize that there is more than just a mere economic objective. Maybe maybe Plyman or Jonathan would like to add to that.
Plyman,
Yes.
what about the BRI? Is it overhyped? Is it a big plan with big words with little substance? How should we assess this?
Speaking of the BRI in general, can you hear me?
Yes.
Speaking of the BRI in general, I do think it's been poorly designed. It's definitely been overhyped, and that's a remark that applies to the BRI in general, and of course it applies to the Western Balkans in particular. I think that I wouldn't, if I understood Jacob's question properly. He was asking whether the Chinese pursue any strategic objectives in the Western Balkans, and that's not my impression. I think that for the time being, Chinese contractors act more opportunistically rather than strategically. They are learning the ropes. They are certainly quick learners. They are getting more sophisticated, but of course, there are very many, there's a lot of controversy in the way they work, the Chinese way of doing business. I would say that what actually applies to the BRI, and then of course the Western Balkans as well, is a contradiction. That, defenders and supporters of the BRI would argue that this is a vast enterprise, it's very complicated, and there should be a margin of flexibility, all right? I would say that what is badly needed is actually coordination in this vast, large enterprise on the part of China. After all, these are all SOEs. And President Xi, because the BRI is his pride and joy, a large chunk of his personal legacy, I would have thought that President Xi would be interested, in having all these projects properly executed. And in fact, there are very many controversial cases which actually mars the image of the BRI and China. So there's a bit of contradiction there that I don't know how exactly the Chinese could explain.
Thank you, Plamen. And I would like to move on to another question, which is linked to this one. That's a question from Ms. Marije Vlaskamp. Can you pose your question? And it's a question to Jonathan.
I'm muted. Sorry about that. Yes, now I'm unmuted, right?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Jonathan Hatwell, I would like you to elaborate a bit further on the issue of lacking communication from the EU. Could you zoom in a bit on the European connectivity plans, the Eurasia connectivity plans? Those plans are hardly known, while BRI has gotten a lot of attention and is, as Tonjev just said, a bit overhyped. How do you explain the fact that the EU has a big connectivity plan, but that is hardly communicated, and how is the EU going to improve that?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, my point about communication, I was specifically referring to achieving awareness in the region about the extent of the EU's commitment and political commitment and financial investment there. But indeed, it's a fair point also. Also in relation to the connectivity strategy, and maybe that leads to a wider question whether the EU needs to get better across the board in communicating what it's doing as a global actor. But in the case of the connectivity strategy, I would say that it is something that is increasingly recognised internally that. We've only taken the first step with the connectivity strategy adopted in October 2018, in terms of coming up with a set of principles that provide our approach on this, and there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of making it a reality and a real factor in our engagement with other regions. Part of that, frankly, and it's my personal perspective on this, is that it's linked to the financial cycle. So maybe we were eager to run before we could walk, and it's important to have the financial means to put behind a strategy. I think in terms of the principles that we set out in the 2018 strategy, they're all extremely sound and do provide a good basis for a principled and market-based approach on connectivity. But if you don't have the financial muscle or firepower to put behind it, then that leads to other issues. And we've got the we've got the financial means now coming on stream with the MFF that's been adopted. And then I would just add a comment to what Plamen said about the BRI being overhyped and implicitly in that regard perhaps a failure. And I think indeed there is plenty of scope for criticising the BRI for having underdelivered, but when it comes to branding and capturing the imagination of the countries that are participating and perhaps more widely the global foreign policy community, I'd say that the BRI has been a resounding success. Whereas, as you rightly point out, EU's connectivity strategy has a lot lower brand name recognition, shall we say. So maybe we don't want to emulate the Chinese or become more like them, but I think we have to recognize that in this case, they've been pretty successful. And once again, as I said before, in relation to the Western Balkans, maybe we also need to up our game as well.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to everybody. We have many more very good questions. They're all very good questions, but unfortunately, we have reached the end of the time that is available for this webinar. So I thank all the participants, and I certainly thank also the people who took the effort to submit questions. We are very happy with your very active participation. There was clearly a lot of interest, interest in this topic, and a lot of things that we could still be further discussing if there would have been more time. But still, I think we should be grateful for a very informative, a very interesting hour of discussion with a lot of very good, important insights delivered to us by our three excellent speakers. So thank you very much, Jonathan, Plamen, and Wouter, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to view our webinar. This webinar will be available on Klingendaal's YouTube channel from tomorrow, and we hope to see you back soon at other Klingendaal events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Plamen.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.